Infinity Foods, now a thriving, successful workers' co-op with about 130 members, I think, was set up just over 50 years ago with the aim of providing natural and organic foods in order to help our community eat well and improve or key into good agricultural practices. It wasn't fundamentally a commercial venture. It had the aim of promoting individual, community and planetary health, which is also the strapline for Brighton Natural Health Centre, which is a charity that was set up by Infinity Foods and is celebrating its 40th birthday this year. We set up the health centre as an extension of the aims and ideals of Infinity to offer the community tools to improve health and well-being, weird and wacky as they were at the time, things like yoga, tai chi, meditation, dance. Well, dance wasn't wacky, but those kind of body, mind, breath practices that we know can make such a significant contribution to mental and physical health. However, the search for individual well-being can risk becoming a somewhat narcissistic pursuit. So we've always tried to offer the skills of our fantastic teachers out into the community. And currently we run quite a wide range of low-cost community classes and also outreach projects, funded outreach projects. As the years have passed, we've also become aware that individual and community health are impossible aims if the planet is sick. And that's why around half of the community talks we've put on have been devoted to environmental issues. So that's Brighton Natural Health Centre. Now I'm going to hand over to Jane to introduce the talks.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks so much, Peter, and thanks so much to your whole team at Brighton Natural Health Centre for inviting us along here to talk to this audience and also the audience online. I think from what you've already said, we're seriously aligned, and I hope that everybody here will get a lot from sharing thoughts with us today. We're really looking forward to it. So the Your Better Nature team is a group of like-minded individuals from across Sussex, and we started up just before lockdown, so it's wonderful to be here in person at last and not through the small screens. And our aim was to help people to realise that we could create a significantly new story for the human story that is more grounded in nature, and that type of story could help us all to live better lives and to help the planet at the same time. We want to share some of that thinking with you today. But first of all, some introductions. And first, I'll start with myself. I'm Jane Mote. I'm a former journalist, and I worked at the BBC for a long time, and I tend to chair the discussions because of that background. But I do actually really seriously believe that we can do better as a human race, and that starts with us working together with nature and seeing ourselves as part of it and not as separate from it. So my job, as well as chairing, is to make sure that we get the best questions asked, not just the ones that I'll be asking, but the ones that you'll be asking later. And along with Vivian Ducey and Dawn Daniel, who are in the audience from the Your Better Nature team, will be encouraging you to participate later. So hang on for that and keep some ideas going for that stage. That would be great. We have a couple of speakers today. One of them, the first one, will be Dr. Tony Whitbread. Tony was CEO of Sussex Wildlife Trust and is now president there. He's an ecologist who loves nothing better than spending time in the woods And I've been lucky enough to spend some time with him in some woods, and he marvels at everything. I mean everything, from the grain of soil in front of him, the insects, the plants, the trees, all of it. And he's full of joy. But he won't be full of joy for all of his talk today, because he's got some fairly hard-hitting information to tell you. But he will cheer you up by the end, I promise. Yeah, definitely. And second speaker is Paul Hannam. Now, Paul was an IT entrepreneur. He'll tell you more about his great success in that, but also on his road to Damascus turnaround after reading a book by Tom Hartman, which a copy is at the back, The Last Hours of the Ancient Sunlight, which spells out some of the serious issues facing us, but it also gives us some hints at answers. And after that, he became an ardent environmentalist, and he's also an author and academic. And I recently had the pleasure of talking to him about his book, The Wisdom of Groundhog Day, and we did that the day after Groundhog Day. And I found it really, really inspirational, the book, because it gave me an idea of how living in the present and looking to what you actually have within yourself can change your whole world and can change the rest of the world positively as well. So Paul will be inspirational, but he'll be challenging too, so watch out for that, because I've heard him talk a few times, and he always throws challenges out to the audience in a very meaningful way. Now, after they've spoken, I've already given you a little hint, we'll be coming to you, so we really enjoy hearing from you and finding out what you've got on your mind, and whether you've been sparked to think of anything new as a result of the talk. So we will be doing that. But I think that's probably enough for me. So we are ready to start with Tony. I think you're going to set the scene on the predicament, but remember, you've got to promise not just doom and gloom.
Not just doom and gloom. Great, thanks very much indeed. And thanks for coming out today on a pretty unpleasant day. Yes, I'll start. Yes, I will start with doom and gloom. So we'd better bolt the doors, make sure nobody makes a run for it before we move on. Yes, well, where do I start? Let's go back a long way. Humans have been on the planet for about 200,000 years, something like that. For about 95% of that time, we were hunter-gatherers, living broadly in harmony with nature. About 10,000 years ago, we started agriculture. And at that point, you could arguably say that our relationship with nature changed. We started to have a much more exploitative approach. Nature was there as a resource to be exploited, to be managed. That gathered pace, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, and it's gathered pace again in this current century as things get more and more towards the exploitation of nature for human benefit. So that's our kind of background, our human story, our attitude is one of exploiting nature for our own benefit. Okay, that's good, and that's the starting point. So how are things going then? If you think about that, how are we doing when it comes to our relationship with nature? Well, as you all know, it's not going that well, is it? If we actually think about several measures of human well-being, we all know about carbon dioxide increases. It's gone up from 280 parts per million. That was 0.028%, I think, if I got the noughts in the right place, from about 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution. The safe level is probably below 350 parts per million. We're currently at about 415 parts per million. So, we all know about this. We're on a trajectory which is not good. Our approach to nature, which is about exploiting nature, indicated by climate change, we're not doing so well. But we've tried, haven't we? These are all the various different protocols, agreements, climate change conferences and so on that have been held in the past in order to try and address this problem, which we have known about. Since about 1860, I think we've known about the greenhouse effect from carbon dioxide. Well, you can see from that graph just how successful we've been with all those conferences. Not very. If you look at that one in the middle there, the UN Climate Change Convention, that's the Framework Convention on Climate Change, was signed, some of you may remember, at the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, about 1992. We signed the Climate Change Convention then. We also signed the Biodiversity Convention then. All the major nations in the world signed to say, yes, we recognise the problem, we're going to do something about it. That was the point with climate change. Okay, we understand, we're going to do something about it. Yes, of course, it was going to be done through market mechanisms, by technology, by all sorts of new innovative changes, regulation, what have you. It was going to be dealt with. 1992. Can you see the difference? There isn't any, is there? But actually, I'm going to say something even more shocking than that. If you look at that point in 1992 and look at all the carbon dioxide that's been emitted since then, more carbon dioxide has been emitted by our society since 1992 than in the entire history of the human race before 1992. This is the way exponential growth works. So since we said we were going to solve the problem, we've emitted more carbon dioxide than in the entire history of the human race beforehand. So that hasn't gone very well, has it? And just to reiterate the point about where we are in long-term history. This is a kind of compressed graph. It's slightly skewed because obviously the scales have been compressed. Also the figures are in Fahrenheit, not centigrade. But the general pattern holds. And that is, if you look at this period, 800,000 years, climate is very variable. It's varied a lot over that period. Even within the period of human history and prehistory, 200,000 years, most of that period, the climate was not very stable. But in the last 10,000 years, in the Holocene, as it's called then, we've had a really unusual period of stable climate, predictable seasons, predictable climatic zones, when it was possible to develop agriculture and to develop civilization. This is an unusual period in history, and we've managed to benefit from that 10,000-year period of relatively stable climate. And we're bringing it to an end by our actions. But it's not just climate. We actually think about biological diversity as well. Nature, we call it biodiversity, but it's nature. If we think about nature, there are various statistics we could talk about. The Worldwide Fund for Nature has done an analysis of about 20,000 populations of vertebrates, that's things with backbones, 20,000 populations of vertebrates around the world. And having done that study, they've found that 68% of them are in decline. So 68%, those populations have gone down by 68%. More than half of the population, more than half of the population level of these vertebrates has disappeared since 1970. That's just in the last, 50 years. And another frightening statistic, if we think about mammals this time, think about the weight, the volume of mammals on Earth, 96% are either us or our livestock, and maybe a few pets. Only 4% is everything else. I find that staggering. Only 4% of the mammals on Earth are blue whales, mice, badgers, lions and tigers. 96% of the weight of all the mammals on Earth are either us or our livestock. Not much room there for further growth, is there? And that's just this is not just about animals a long way away, extinctions that happen in the tropical rainforest or in the ocean. This is at home as well. Do we know what this bird is? I'm sure some of you do. The turtle dove. The sound of the turtle dove. This used to be a common bird in the English landscape, in the British landscape. People say that the sound of the turtle dove is like the sound of a contented cat purring. So it's a really lovely sound that we used to hear in the British countryside. It used to be a fairly common bird. Since 1990, this has gone down by 98%. So I'm not surprised that nobody jumped up and down and said, yes, I know that bird. 98% loss since 1990. How long will it be before the sound and sight of a turtle dove will just be a shadow of what we once knew? And it's not just the turtle dove. We can produce similar statistics for things like water voles, eels, dormice, water, and so on. And even things that we once thought of as common. Sparrows, house sparrows, for example, starlings, song thrushes, they've all gone down in population. So we're losing biodiversity. And what we have to conclude is that, there's been 5 mass extinctions in the past. Biodiversity has gone up and down over a very long time scale in the past, but at 5 occasions we can actually say they were huge events and they have been called mass extinction events. One of them are there, 250 million years ago in the Permian, has been called the Great Dying. At the time it's thought that volcanoes emitted large amounts of carbon dioxide over 1,000 years or so. They emitted large amounts of carbon dioxide. There was runaway climate change. The ocean started to acidify. The ocean current started to break down. Is any of this sounding familiar? And that was 250 million years ago. 95% of the species on Earth were lost at that time. It took at least 10 million years to recover from that mass extinction. Generally, it takes 10 million years to recover from a mass extinction. The other one we probably know about, was when the asteroid that hit the Earth wiped out the dinosaurs about 66 million years ago. Okay, so that's the 5 mass extinctions that have happened so far. We have to conclude, actually, that we're in the 6th mass extinction right now. Most scientists now say we have entered the 6th mass extinction. We are losing species as fast as in the previous mass extinctions. Estimates vary, but between 100 and 1,000 times faster than the normal background loss of species is what we're experiencing now. And what's caused this? What's caused this mass extinction? People. That's a random people. I just chose that. So it's just a person. So we know what's caused this problem. We know it's our actions that are actually causing this mass extinction. It's also know how to cure it as well. If we've caused it, then we can cure it as well. Okay, so at this point you could say, well, okay, but we have progress. We have economic growth, we have technology, we have our own human existence. Maybe that's a shame, but that's the price of progress. Well, let's think about that for a while. This is the picture of the Earth. Everything we know and need is on, apart from sunshine, which we also need, everything we know and need is in a thin zone around that planet, around the Earth. How blue it is, how green it is, the presence of ice on the poles, how salty the sea is, the chemical composition of the air, all of those things are determined by life. Every molecule of oxygen you've ever breathed has come from life. Every drop of water you've drunk, every mouthful of food is all there because of a functioning environment. If we think about the width of this stage as the total history of the planet, then from the start there was no oxygen until about halfway across the stage. All that time, the atmosphere was basically carbon dioxide, 95% carbon dioxide. Life changed that because of plants growing and photosynthesizing. From about halfway across the stage, we get free oxygen. On that scale, human existence on the planet is probably less than the width of the human hair on the left-hand end. So that puts it into context, how important life is to the planet. We think about all the things we rely on, the very composition of the air, the composition of the sea, the composition of the water, the composition of the geology. Think about the chalk. Chalk is made up of very small mollusks, crustaceans, which have settled out and actually created the chalk. That's life, creating geology. So even the geology of the planet is determined by life. An example I like to give about how important this is, just one example, I could choose many. Let's think about the great whales, the grey whales that swim the ocean. Putting aside the fact that it's actually wrong to wipe out through hunting the biggest mammals that have ever lived, it's wrong to do that. Put that to one side. These animals actually have a function in the environment. Great whales eat large amounts of food. Well, they would, wouldn't they? They're quite big. So they eat large amounts of food, often low down in the ocean. They come to the surface of the ocean to defecate. You didn't know it was all going to be about whale poo today, did you? They come to the surface of the ocean to defecate, and that turbocharges the growth of algae in the sea. It fertilizes the algae in the sea that grow massively. In growing, they absorb carbon dioxide. That starts off that goes into the ecosystem and kind of fuels the whole ecosystem. Turns the whole thing over. You get a nutrient cycle basically fired by these whales. In the process, of course, it locks up lots of carbon because that then sinks to the bottom of the sea. Whales are a carbon pump taking carbon out of the atmosphere. They're also the driving force in nutrient cycles in the ocean. Whale populations today are less than 1% of what they were before we started hunting them. Another thought about that is people have had a go at valuing that value, valuing whales to humans. If you value a whale, if you hunt it, take it away and sell the meat, it's worth about $50,000. Okay, so somebody gets $50,000, that's great. So it feeds into the economy. Sorry about the ecology, but that's much more important. We've got the economy. Okay, but then if you do the sums again and you actually look at that whale and think, well, how valuable is it to humanity if you actually calculate the function that it's doing? If you look at the value of the carbon that it's sequestering, carbon has a value. Even if we pretend it doesn't, it has a value. If you put a very modest value on that carbon, on carbon alone, one whale is worth at least $2 million. That's carbon alone, not even thinking about the other nutrient cycling cycles that it does. So if you did that proper valuing of a whale, $50,000 for meat, $2 million just to help with the carbon cycle, you can see that actually by not monetizing and not trading natural capital, you're actually delivering more value to humans, to humanity. By leaving the whale in the sea is more value to humanity than harvesting it. Okay, however, our economy attributes value to useless things. Piece of plasticky tat like that, great. You know, somebody built it, somebody got the resources, it's paid somebody's mortgage in the process, had a little bit of fun with it, then we threw it away, maybe causing pollution, maybe causing industrial accidents along the way. All of those things are counted as positive in the way we actually do our economic calculations. Meanwhile, the economy puts almost no value at all on things that are essential. So this tatty old piece of woodland, there's no factories there, it's not really producing anything. All those trees are a bit old and twisted, they're no value to anybody, surely. By the way, this is one of our best nature reserves in the Sussex Wildlife Trust of international importance for ecology, but no value at all, of course. And this is where we're stuck with our current way of economic valuing. We attribute almost no value at all to things that are essential, and loads of value to things that are completely useless. But it gets worse. If we think of that piece of plasticky tat, everything to do with that, its production, the mining of resources, the use, the throwing away, and then the pollution it causes, that's all economic activity, and that's all counted as benefit. That's all counted under gross domestic product. Meanwhile, everything to do with the environment, you've probably heard it, haven't you? A burden on the economy. This all holds back the economy. Everything to do with the environment is counted as a cost. A number of times I've been asked by, I don't know, radio presenters or something, when we come up with a nice idea for an ecological project, they give that kind of gotcha question. Yes, that's all very well, but how much does it cost? So we don't actually value the value, we only value the cost when it comes to the environment. The dice could not be more unevenly loaded. Everything to do with the economy is counted as a benefit, and any cost is counted as an externality. Everything to do with the environment is counted as a cost, and any benefit is counted as an externality. No wonder we have hard trouble actually getting anywhere. Okay, so this is a graph I got from somewhere. Unfortunately, I don't know the attribution, but it shows if we're looking at the way we measure our economy and the material footprint that we have, they're completely in step. The idea of green growth, the idea that actually we can carry on growing as long as we're more efficient, we do things better, we have better technology. I can't see any great sign of it working there. Obviously, we need these technologies, but when it actually comes down to it, our growth is in step with our material consumption, our material imprint. Think about a growth rate of 3%. That's a doubling time of 25 years. Every 25 years, which is roughly what we try to do. Every 25 years, our economic activity will double. Within that 25 years, our environmental footprint will be the same as the entire history of the human race before that 25 years. That gets back to the carbon dioxide figure I gave to you earlier. So you see that the driving force behind a lot of these problems that I've been showing you is actually our attitude to all sorts of things, including the economy. Let's look at some other thoughts as well. Have you seen the film that David Attenborough did? In my view, it's the best film he's ever done. It's called Breaking Boundaries. If you get Netflix, you can see it. But he was looking at 9 planetary boundaries that scientists have identified that we need to stay within. And you can look at this diagram here. We need to be in the green for all of these features here. As you can see, we're well outside. We're outside even the amber with a lot of these things. And if you look at the top there, there's things to do with biodiversity, things to do with nature, things to do with nutrient flows, way into the red. We're already well into the danger zone. We look at climate change, that's not even the worst. There's only one thing going in the right direction here. You can probably see what it is, and that's actually the ozone hole. That was one thing that actually is going in the right direction. Everything else is going way into the amber and possibly into the red. We're in danger zones at the moment. Some of them haven't been quantified or hadn't when this diagram was put together. Novel entities, I think that's called, pollution and so on. That has been quantified now, and we're well into the amber. So this gives you an idea of how we're striding well into the danger zone when it comes to our major planetary boundaries. I recommend you see that programme. We need to think again. We need a new relationship with nature. So this is where I think we need to think more positively about, okay, so we can recognise all that. That's the background. I guess a lot of you knew all this background, although I think it bears retelling, because even as environmentalists, I think sometimes we don't grasp the urgency and scale of the problem. So it bears retelling. We need a new relationship with nature. We need a new way of looking at the economy. And it's not without people having a go. Here's a model that was presented by a global level professor in economics working for the Treasury. The British Treasury came up with this model. instead of gross domestic product, we need to be thinking about inclusive wealth. We need to be thinking about what happens to these three aspects of capital. Underpinning all of that, of course, at the bottom there is natural capital. Nothing else works without natural capital. The economy is a subset of the environment, not the other way round. And this has to be firmly stated. You can't do anything unless you look after the environment. So natural capital. And fundamentally, like the example with the whale, a lot of these things are non-tradable. You can't exchange them. You can't even own a lot of these things. So you need to think about, well, what does that mean in terms of the way we design our economy? There's the model of donut economics. I dare say some of you have heard about this, Kate Raworth's donut economics model, where there's a kind of band in the green zone there, which is below our environmental ceiling, below our ecological ceiling, but where people are outside the social foundation. So they're lifted out of poverty, but don't go beyond the ecological ceiling. So that's the donut economic model. We need to move away from this sort of model that we have at the moment, where we take resources, we make something, we use things briefly, and then we chuck them away. Take, make, use, lose. And all of these things actually are positive under GDP, but we all know that actually a lot of these things are negative, and what's right in the middle could be completely trivial, and yet it doesn't work. We need a model which is much more circular, like this, where actually we don't take many new resources, we don't waste by throwing things away. We do a lot of things on the one side by technical innovation, by recycling, repurposing, upcycling, those sorts of things, but also when it comes to biological material, thinking regeneratively. We can't think about exploiting, taking, in order to provide things for us. We need to think about regeneration and what that means. Well, thinking about that in terms of agriculture, there are all sorts of models out there. Around Sussex, around the globe, there are many different ways that are being addressed. Permaculture. Permaculture can deliver more per acre than the most intensive modern agriculture. The same with forest food gardens. The idea you can have multi-layered cropping, much more productive per acre than many modern agricultural approaches. Thinking about regenerative agriculture and, yes, reintegrating animals into agricultural systems. Regenerative agriculture, and again, many farmers in Sussex I've directly spoken to are suddenly talking all about regenerative agriculture. Even modern arable farmers are starting to reintegrate more multi-cropping approaches in order to try and regenerate soils, biodiversity and hydrology, not simply mine it for resources. The idea of regeneration, so you're looking after your soils, you're building soils. At the moment we're losing soils. Every year large amounts wash out to sea. We need to regenerate and rebuild soils. Perfectly possible, happening all over the place, we just need to upscale. And we mentioned rewilding earlier, when Isabella Tree was here giving a talk. Rewilding, that's perhaps the fundamental thing. We're actually rebuilding systems and enabling nature to function for itself. The extreme of rewilding is actually to get nature to function, we're not taking any resources. But the principle works more generally. Can we rebuild nature, encourage nature to work for itself? Not just make it work for us, but allowing it to work for itself. Putting natural processes back in place and encouraging nature to work. The idea of rewilding. So these are the sorts of changes we need to see, we need to make. We need to change our basic approach to the economy. We need to change our basic relationship to nature. We're part of nature, not separate from it. But all of this leaves a question unanswered. And this is about us. It's about our attitude. It's about our human story. What it is to actually, what are the values that underpin this? Is everything I'm saying now just against human nature? It's all very well, but we'll never do it because we're just out for the next new pair of trainers or something. So is this our human nature, to simply be exploitative, to simply be competitive, to be selfish, to fight against each other? Or is there another human story? I want to leave it at that now and pass over to Paul. Thank you.
We've been hearing about the science, and it's absolutely essential to understand the scientific background, what the key numbers are. But in my work, I've focused more over the last 25 years on the psychological, the political, the spiritual, the cultural, and economic basis of how we ended up in this complete mess. Because the climate crisis is very much a projection of the human crisis. And I want to talk a little bit about the lessons I've learned. So I've worked in a number of different areas in the environment. I was an academic, I taught at university, so I got to know the science quite well. I also ran 3 green businesses, and I got to know the business side and the technology side. I've worked a lot on climate psychology to try and understand that. And it strikes me that one of the biggest lessons for me is that we are largely the problem, and we find it very difficult to address the deeper philosophical, psychological, and spiritual issues about what it means to be a human being at this extraordinarily difficult time. And I want to cover this today. The first lesson I've really learned is that knowledge is not enough. From the point of view of the Earth, being a climate denier is no different from being a member of the Green Party yet doing nothing. You know, and the thing is, what I've found again from 25 years is we now know a lot. You know, I was going to talks like this 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and people were learning about it, and a lot of people wanted to take action. But for whatever reason, we have made some changes, but nowhere near enough. And there's been this failure across all of Western civilization in many ways to translate knowledge into action. There's something stopping us from changing. We can change some things. We can go and recycle. You know, we'll talk a bit about technology in a minute. But the really profound changes we need to make, for whatever reason, we've been unable to make them. And we need to address this. We can't run away from this issue. The next big lesson for me is technology won't save us. Because we're part of an economic system where technology has delivered extraordinary benefits. As Jane said, I worked in the IT industry. You might have heard something called Moore's Law, where computing power basically doubles every year. You know, in the early 1980s, I was selling IBM systems as big as this stage for, I don't know, 10, 15 million pounds. You can fit it in a strand of hair now, the processing power these days. We've made these amazing changes, and people naturally look to technology to rescue us, to save us. Bill Gates recently wrote a book about this, but there's some fundamental problems with this approach. The first of which is that for every technological improvement, there is often unintended consequences. You might have read about these big geoengineering ideas, you know, of reflecting heat back up, or, you know, carbon capture, sequestration. These, again, use a huge amount of energy to get going, but they're all about trying to fix things without us fundamentally changing our behavior. That's the problem. But there's another big problem with this, in that technology could help us with climate change. I'm not sure if it will do it in the timescales we need, but it's feasible that we could come up with a new technology which could save us. But what it won't do is help us with the biodiversity crisis we're facing. And there's a lot of emphasis at the moment on climate change, on what we call climate breakdown, but less and less on the wholesale destruction of nature, which Tony referred to. Just for example, I don't know if you know, you might have read in the news, that in the month of January, the destruction of the Amazon rainforest was about 500% more intense than a year ago. So coming out of the 2-year lockdown, when we hoped, we prayed it might be a chance for us to really reinvent human society, we are reverting to the past, and it's actually looking worse than it was before. So again, because we're part of a capitalist system, the natural approach is we'll find a technology solution. I don't believe this. I think it's an excuse, it's a distraction. Yes, it's important. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's not going to be the answer. I have an electric car. Is it going to save the planet? Absolutely not. We're locked basically into a dysfunctional system. It's a system, I'm not saying there's some evil set of people who've created this, but from the Industrial Revolution, from the rise of capitalism, from the growth of consumerism, we've developed this system which has given us tremendous advances in, you know, quality of life, longevity, healthcare. There's no question of this. But the effect of having 8 billion people trying to and aspire to the lifestyle of an average American or English person, you know, it's insane. We need about 5 or 6 planets. It's just not feasible. We have to have a different system. There is no way around that. And technology, knowledge will not change that. We have to change the system. Now, putting my psychological hat on, I feel we are actually addicted to a very toxic lifestyle. Now, addiction, we think of, you know, drugs, we think of drink. But actually, if you look at it, the way most people live, it is a form of addiction. Nobody questions the fact that we need more. We need to get a bigger house, we need to go on more holidays, we need to buy more stuff. And we are exposed to thousands of messages every day telling us that our happiness, our well-being is based on what we own, on what we can buy, because that's how the system has developed. And it's reached a point where we can't continue that way, and we need to radically assess our lifestyle. What is, and I'll come on to this question, what is the good life? Because the notion we grew up of the good life, of more, 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 is totally unsustainable. And unless we address this underlying assumptions of what the good life is, we will be stuck. We might be materially better off, but we are emotionally and spiritually impoverished. In my professional work, I do a lot of work around mental health. I do programs in corporations where I go in and put together mental health programs. And you probably know that we're going through a huge crisis at the moment in mental health. The World Health Organization has said that by 2030, depression will be the leading cause of disease in the world. It will be the biggest health problem we have in the world. And if you look at the numbers, there's a strong correlation often with wealth and anxiety and depression. So we're better off at some ways, but we're less happy. And that's got to be telling us something. It's got to be telling us something. There's something fundamentally wrong here. And we all know people who've suffered from mental health. It's been exacerbated by the pandemic. But even before that, the underlying causes is that the system can never make you truly happy. You know, just buying stuff, just progressing your career, looking for more status, more wealth, it's what we call in psychology the hedonic treadmill. It will never make you truly happy because you always need more and more and more. And that's how the system works. So for me, the climate and ecological crisis is a projection of our human crisis. Now, I am not saying that it's all down to us as individuals. The fact is, I believe very strongly that the villains include fossil fuel companies, that they include government, big business, all the people we can look to. A book I thoroughly recommend is called The New Climate War by Michael Mann, an American professor. And what he's done is shown how fossil fuel companies, apart from causing so many of the problems, have made us believe that it's our fault. Did you know that the carbon calculator was invented by BP? It was a way of making us take responsibility that we have to check our carbon footprint, rather than looking at changing the system or how the whole system is based on fossil fuels. And this is what tobacco companies do. It's a well-known corporate tactic. So we do need to understand what's going on, but we also have to understand our part in this. Because in the words of Paul Hannam, the American environmentalist, the climate crisis is not a science problem, it's a human problem. The ultimate power to change the world does not reside in technologies, it relies on reverence, respect, and compassion for ourselves, for all people, and for all life. This is regeneration. And it's thinking about this, what are our values, what's really important to us, is at the heart of making changes. So, in terms of what the challenge is, if we look at, there are three main ways of thinking about our human story or our human nature. One of the biggest problems we have in terms of dealing with the climate change is in evolutionary terms, we're not designed to solve it. And let me explain that. Basically, we are cave men and women with iPhones. In terms of our brains, we have not evolved that much since the savannah. And we think more about short-term problems rather than long-term problems. We think more about our immediate location rather than the world outside. It's called proximity bias. We think more about concrete issues like how to fix a chair rather than big abstract problems like, you know, climate breakdown. And we think more about the needs of our immediate family rather than our descendants going forward. And all of this makes it very, very hard for us to deal with the scope, nature, and long-term effects of climate breakdown and ecological breakdown. So in terms of our evolutionary drivers, we need to overcome them in many ways. And we need to understand that human nature is to be in small groups, is to deal with the short term, is not to think about big wide spans or global problems. We were never designed for this. You know, technology, culture has changed dramatically, but our basic brain has not evolved to keep up with this. And this is a real disconnect and dissonance in our problems. Then the next part of our nature is what we call our conditioned nature. This is your upbringing, your parenting, your schooling, but also your cultural norms and values, which I was describing earlier, are very much based in Christian traditions, other religions too, but primarily in consumerism as being the way to live. And I'm not just talking about buying stuff, it's consuming nature, consuming experiences. It's all about more and all about expanding ourselves and seeing ourselves as here primarily to consume things. And we've been brought up with this conditioned nature. We have all this advertising. Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. Has anyone heard of Edward Bernays by any chance? Absolutely brilliant man who should be at the forefront of history, because he pretty much invented modern marketing, advertising and public relations back in the 20s. And before the First World War, consumerism barely existed in the world. And we think of it as being around for, hundreds, thousands of years, but it's very much a modern phenomenon which was developed largely after the First World War in order to build up demand, because the Americans and a lot of other European economies were terrified of having a communist revolution, as there had been in Russia. And if you look at the history of this, it's fascinating how this consumerism has hijacked our mind and our mindset and our culture. And it's very difficult. We're rather like fish in a tank. We can't see beyond the water. It's so natural to us. For most people, you just have to look at the press every day, look at magazines. It's the way we're built. So we need to overcome this. We need to overcome our evolutionary nature and our conditioned nature. But we have, and in wonderful words of Krishnamurti, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And it is a profoundly sick society in so many ways. We've seen the evidence in Tony's talk. When historians look back at our century, they won't be worried about parties in Downing Street. They won't be worried about Ukraine. What they'll say is, how did we allow this to happen? How did we allow this to happen? How did we look away? In the same way we look back at slavery, or we look at the way women were treated, or children, or minorities. It's unbelievable that we're allowing this to happen. And from a historical, bigger perspective, it makes sense. But we also have what we call our better nature. Every one of us has something beyond our conditioning. In my work, I call it our authentic self. You could call it your higher self, the best version of you. Religious terms, your soul. It's that part of you which is more loving, more compassionate, more caring. It's a part of you that many of us developed during the lockdown, when we helped our neighbours, when we clapped for nurses, when we thought about key workers, people we overlooked. My son is a key worker, and he got COVID very seriously in the first couple of weeks of March 2020. And for the first time, he felt that people really understood him and appreciated him. So we have that propensity, that ability to really care. And we have a better nature. But the problem is we're in a culture that encourages and enhances our conditioned nature rather than our better nature. And until we can develop our better nature, it will be very hard for us to really tackle these profound crises that we're all facing. So from my perspective, and from what the work that Tony and I and Jane did together, is we need a new story about the good life and what matters most. We need to reinvent ourselves, and it starts by the stories that we tell ourselves. All of us have stories. We have a story about how we got here, where we're going, who we are, why we do the things we do. And a lot of this story is based on the conditioned nature I've been describing, but we need a new story about what it means to be human. A story about our better nature. About compassion, appreciation, justice, connection. These are words which are abstract in many ways, but we've all felt them. We've all felt them at different times for our family, for our loved ones, but we need to extend it. We need to develop what psychologists call our ecological self. So we see that we're more than just this individual collection of atoms here. We're part of nature, and really extend these values far further afield. We need to build our story on our authentic needs. There was a brilliant Chilean economist called Max Neef who developed this concept of pseudo-satisfiers. And what he said is the economy is built on pseudo-satisfiers. That's the need for status, for power, for short-term gratification, for wealth, for control, all these things which we think we're getting. But we need to be building our story and our future on our authentic needs. And here are some of these that I've listed up here. We can all recognise them: our physical health, mental health, a reasonable standard of living, employment, freedom, community, fulfilment. These are things we can all say, yes, I agree with that. But this is the key. When I first studied psychology 40 years ago now, all of psychology was about disorders, depression, dysfunction. You learned about schizophrenia. But nobody talked about happiness. Nobody talked about fully functioning people. It was all about what was wrong. But about 30 years ago, Martin Seligman and a group of American psychologists developed this notion of positive psychology, which was the formal study of well-being, of happiness, of fulfillment and joy. And there have now been thousands of studies done at most of the world's leading universities. Governments are looking at it now, measuring happiness. It's become very popular. But for me, the really important message of this is that our happiness has very little to do with our standard of living. Once we reach a certain point, now if you are struggling, most definitely, but once you reach the median income in any country, your happiness barely improves going above it. So it is important to bring people up. But if you think the gap between rich and poor in my lifetime, how dramatically it has increased, and how you can now have, 4 billionaires probably own the same national wealth as all of sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, it's just insane, the difference and the problem. And this is what people are aspiring to. This is the story. But we need to understand we actually don't need that much to be happy. But real happiness, the foundations of happiness, come from love, from relationships, from health, from finding meaning, from service, from believing in something, from volunteering, all these areas, physical and mental health. This is the key to your happiness. And it's a story about being connected to nature, not separate from it. And again, we're very lucky, and there's a huge amount of research showing that you increase your happiness by connecting to nature. You might have heard of things like forest bathing, which has been very well researched in Japan, the benefits of literally just lying in a forest or by trees, hugging a tree. It actually does work. But there's a lot of research now that doctors are now prescribing walking, going out in nature for anxiety and for depression. And we're realizing in mental health now that being outside is incredibly important. But what's happened, we've created a life where we go from one box into another box, a car, to another box, the office, and spend all day looking at boxes, our phones. We've created this sedentary lifestyle that's absolutely catastrophic for us. And I know I'm guilty, I spend too much time on screens, but the more outside you can get, the better. And it's a story about contributing to the earth, not just consuming it. We have to turn it round and see that our role in life, especially now at this critical moment in history, is to stop consuming so much and start contributing it back to it and become a citizen of the earth. A story about how humans and nature can both flourish together. We are part of nature. We are animals. We are a species. Yes, we're human, but we've created this illusion, this exceptionalism, that we're different to everything else, and the rest of the species, the rest of the ecosystem has to serve us. And we need to have a much clearer sense of equity and better relationship to other species. Because loving the earth is loving yourself, ultimately. In very simple terms, maybe not something you thought about or seen before, but once you extend yourself, we are part of the ecosystem. As Crosby, Stills and Nash sang, we are stardust. And it's also loving your children and your grandchildren. Often when I talk to people, and I talk to business audiences, I ask people whose children go to private school, how much investing, who here is leaving their money to children, and everybody, every family wants to help their children. But what are we really doing? And their grandchildren? We are leaving a legacy that's catastrophic. And loving the earth is loving your children and grandchildren, which is leaving a legacy where we're going to have a life worth living, a world worth living on. And once you look at that longer time frame and think about it, what's the impact of what I'm doing today on my grandchildren? And if you don't have grandchildren, any generation in the future. We need to be thinking in these terms. I put the Prime Directive up here. Anyone a Trekkie here or a Star Trek fan? No? Oh, it's just me then. Well, in Star Trek, the big idea, and Gene Roddenberry was a real visionary, actually, a fascinating man who developed Star Trek. The prime directive was that when Starfleet went to any new planet or any new civilization, the prime directive was you never interfere with it. And that's what you learned from day one. Everything you did was based on that. We need a prime directive that what we do from now on, we have to put nature first. We have to put the climate first. We can't have the environment as a subset of the economy. Yeah? It has to be the other way round. We have to have a prime directive in everything we do, from the way we educate, our politics, our society. It's not going to happen overnight. It might sound idealistic, but until we do that, it's going to be very difficult for us to change. And I want to leave with my favourite quote from Einstein. There are only two ways to live your life. One is though nothing is a miracle, and the other is though everything is a miracle. When you listen to Tony, when you really think about the odds of being life at all on this planet, we could be the only planet with life in the whole universe. Just think about that for a moment. Think about the odds of you ever being born, of being here. Think of the odds of having the right chemical composition here, gravity, the right distance from the moon, the sun, all these factors. It's like winning the lottery every day throughout your life. Yet, what do? We lose sight of this. We lose sight of the miracle. We lose sight of our role in Earth. And until we can really get that and start from that premise of how incredibly fortunate and blessed we are to be here, we will continue to treat the Earth as a trash can when we should be worshipping it in the way indigenous cultures have done traditionally. We've lost our rituals. We've lost this connection to the sacredness of our planet. And you don't need to be religious to believe. I'm not a religious person, but I feel I'm spiritual in terms of believing that nature is truly sacred. And all the evidence, and this is where science and spirituality do meet, and psychology meets. All the evidence is there. All the pieces of the jigsaw are there. All the ingredients of a recipe are there. We just have to put them together and take action. Just the knowledge is not enough. So I leave you these two questions. What is your better nature? And what is your new story? And on that note, I'll thank you.
Yeah, in spite of all of these things, you can see many examples where the Earth restores itself given the chance. Just off the coast here, there's the Kelp Project, where actually we're just allowing nature to restore itself. There's already signs that kelp is regrowing, one of the major marine ecosystems, just by removing the trawling pressure that was on that area. You've all heard of the kelp of NEP and the rewilding project there. Again, put nature back in place and it restores itself. There's an area the size of France in China where at the head of the Yellow River is called the Yellow River because it's full of silt, and it's full of silt because of the way the catchment is being treated. Well, now it's being restored, and something that was basically desert is green again, and it's an area the size of France. So there's plenty to be optimistic about, and I think there's plenty to be optimistic about learning from COVID and the way we all responded. According to all the films, we should have turned into monsters. We should be out there fighting with each other for the last toilet roll or whatever it was. Yeah, there were exceptions, okay. But actually, that's not what happened, is it? Practically every street had a WhatsApp group to work out and to make sure everybody was okay. People were meeting people and talking to them who they'd never spoken to before. Where I live in the countryside, I was talking to people who I hadn't met and didn't know me, and the things they were talking about were what they'd seen in nature. They didn't know I was anything to do with the Wildlife Trust, but they were routinely saying, isn't it amazing, I've seen that big bird today, what is it? People were noticing. So, I mean, the point about our better nature is that we do have a better nature. This kind of consumptive, dominating, selfish, me-first society is a recent phenomenon which is temporary, and it will go away, because that's not what we're like.
Thank you, Tony. I feel restored now. Yes, that's much better. Paul, just building on that, how do you get more people to subscribe to that? You know, how do they realise they've got enough stuff and there's a different focus that they can have in life?
That's a very good question. For me, well, education is certainly very important. I mean, when I was educated, you know, you go to school, you go to university, it's all about who can get the best job, earn the most money, then you get a house, and there's just this whole trajectory which is taken for granted across the Western world. That's what you do. And we need to be offering an alternative vision from the very earliest years. For me, I think it's knowledge. I think if people really understand the latest research on psychology, on well-being, on neuroscience, and understand that their happiness is dependent on things very different to what they believe they were. That knowledge is important. And then coming together in groups. I think one of the challenges, I've worked a lot with local environmental groups, and often the talks end up being about recycling or solar panels. And I'm not saying these things aren't important, but I know we're trying to establish a climate cafe, and you know, this is a model. We need to have a way of people coming together to talk about the subjects we're covering today and how it impacts your life, because it's only through socialization that you can change. The best change programs always involve other people, peers, your friends, your families, people like you who are making a change at the same time. Actually, the best change program is things like Alcoholics Anonymous. We need a Consumers Anonymous or something like that. Honestly, I'm being quite serious saying that. Yeah.
I'm interested in that, and also from your book, The Wisdom of Groundhog Day, how that Phil, when he's the main character, is stuck without any of the normal trappings of his life, and he has to look inward, and he has to make do with what he's got, and that making do and realising what you've got is enough. That could be a movement in itself, and I don't know whether there are movements around that or not.
Well, there are some movements, very few of them, I'll be honest, but you've raised an incredibly important point. We are educated to look outwards. We're educated to acquire knowledge. In psychology, we call this horizontal development. We get qualifications, we get knowledge, we get stuff. But very little of our education is inward, is looking at our inner life. And that's where the answers are, really, for me, is changing, understanding, as in the movies, you rightly said, we've already got everything we need to be happy, most of us. And I'm sure many of you here will have been to places when you travel where you've been to very much poorer communities and seen that people are far happier than we are. They're far happier. And they're not putting it on, they genuinely are. And so that's got to be telling us something. But for me, it all comes in the inner life. And we've lost so much of that. We've lost a lot of our religions, our rituals, our ways of finding meaning in life, and we need to refine those and help each other. So mindful groups are an example. I know in America there are groups looking at minimalism and simplifying your life, but it's avoiding just making it about buying less stuff. It's also about having a more positive vision. So it's not wearing a hair shirt. That's very important, because guilt never works for change. Yeah. I'm a Catholic, I know.
I'm glad about that. Don't go to guilt with me either. Tony, just looking at some of the other things, the aspect of a story is language, and the language we use can shape so much. And you were talking about regenerative rather than exploitative. Are there other things that you wish people would start saying about the world that actually might help to improve it?
Yeah, there's kind of words that we've adopted, and they're supposed to be good words, and they're simply not. The whole language around consumer and consumption. You know, consumption used to be another name for TB. Consumption is a thing that you end up having to do, perhaps, but it shouldn't be what leads our society. In fact, maybe a little takeaway message for people here is that if anybody calls you a consumer in the future, punch them on the nose. You're not here to be a consumer. So I think, you know, some of this language that we use is the wrong language. We talk about regeneration. Maybe it's not the right word. I don't know. It's the whole point about living in harmony. Again, that's a little bit sandals, isn't it? But you know what I mean. Living in harmony with nature, the ability to have 2 and 2 equaling 5, not just 2 and 2 equaling 3 because you're exploiting. You actually work together for win-wins. You know, not accepting situations where somebody has to lose. I think there is something about the way we use our language and with the way we've been trained into thinking that to have one thing here, somebody else has to lose over there. If that's the case, then we're in the wrong forum. You know, we need to be thinking about how we work together to achieve combined wins, and that may not be material. So about material consumption and material things. So there's something about the language which I think we need to be in a different place. Instead of saying, you know, either we should be a consumer or we shouldn't be a consumer, we shouldn't even be thinking about consumption. There are so many more interesting things to think about. Be a poet, be a husband, be a wife, be religious, be something else. But don't just think how big your television is.
Paul's grabbing the mic here. And then we're coming to you guys.
Just about question language, it's incredibly important. we, for example, now use the term climate breakdown rather than climate change, because climate change sounds quite benign, doesn't it? You know, it would be nice if it was a couple of degrees warmer, but of course, climate change is much more about, you know, it's about unexpected weather events like we've had in the last 2 days. But also, the one that always got me was sustainability. It's not the most empowering terms. If I said, oh, I've got a very sustainable marriage, I mean, it's not very exciting, is it? We need something very positive, very, you know, more visionary.
Thank you for that. Now, what are your thoughts? You've been a wonderfully attentive audience. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your questions. Does anyone want to start?
Hello. I've got a couple of questions. One more relevant to what you guys were just talking about. What are your thoughts on, obviously, bypassing consumer culture is a valid thing for us all to do. Do you think there's any merit in rather than completely bypassing consumer culture, reverting to a more kind of reuse, second-hand consumer economy? Are there any pitfalls with that? Do you have any thoughts on that? And secondly, as a sort of as a layman, I don't have a huge amount of knowledge about rewilding and stuff. Would it be more beneficial for me to focus primarily on rewilding what I have immediate access to, like as in like a garden, or would it be better to join a rewilding project, for example, where maybe I don't own the land, but I'm involved in that way? Sorry, it's quite a long topic, 2 questions. But
Shall I start with rewilding, because that's close to my heart? Yeah. Rewilding is a fantastic concept. So it's an idea of just keeping it in your mind. And the point about rewilding is to rebuild nature, put nature back in place so it can function for itself. So that's the background. Now, actually, in a small urban garden, there's limited amount you can do for that if you think big scale. But there's always something. Even a very, very small square, if you think about a small plot of land more in terms of the nature and the way it works, rather than the garden that you're going to make. So it's changing from the attitude of making things do what you want them to do to the idea of, well, thinking about nature. How's nature working? How can I encourage it to work? What's missing that I can get back in place? So I could talk for hours about this, but that's the kind of background. And I think even with a small space, you can do that, even by supporting other groups. I mean, one of the, thinking about the positive things that we can actually do, the first thing that Paul often says is join a group, because it's much better to work with people of like minds. There's all sorts of benefits you get. And I think increasingly there are people who are thinking about rewilding in all sorts of contexts. Now, quite often, it's not rewilding. Rebuilding a hay meadow is not rewilding, but it's a jolly good thing to do. So, you're moving along the wild spectrum. So anything that does that, I think, is a benefit to nature. You can rewild your garden while still getting produce, for example. So there's all sorts of ways you can think about it. So yes, I'd answer that in 2 or 3 levels. Yeah, think about the approach of rewilding, the philosophy of rewilding. Apply it to your local space if you can, just by thinking about, well, how does nature work in this place, and actually apply it by working with others as well. So yes, all together. Shall I leave you with recycling?
Sure. Yeah, in terms of recycling, reusing, you talk about buying reuse things. Yeah, very good idea. But for me, a lot of work I do is around mindfulness. So I'm sure many people here practice mindfulness. But for me, mindfulness isn't just a meditation technique. It's being mindful of your behavior. And when you go to buy something, it's actually being mindful of why you're doing it. Because a lot of, the consumer system, to use that word, is built on the fact that people use consumption as a way to feel good about themselves, to avoid feeling bad, as a sort of short-term fix. And so often we buy things that we don't necessarily need, just about that dopamine fix. And it's being mindful of why you're doing it, and then saying, is there a way I could buy this in a more environmental, ecological way, which would be going to a charity shop, say, rather than buying new things, or just buying less. I look at when I was running my IT business, I had a very different life, believe me, in the 90s, and I had about 20 suits and things like that. And I didn't need them, but that's what you did. I was unconscious. I was not being mindful about what I needed. Now I've got maybe 2 suits, but it's just, you don't really need that much. You really don't. That's the key. But everything is going back to the source. What do I really want? Why am I doing this? And that can be quite challenging, but it's very valuable.
I listen to you. You have something else to challenge us with. And I heard many years ago a talk by Dick O'Nyans, who was president of the Royal Society of Arts at the time, and he talked about, and it was the image that Tony, you showed, which was of that somebody had created with inclusive wealth in the middle. This was a new, and Dick O'Nyans talked about the original meaning of the word wealth, which actually is of well-being. So I think what you're both talking about is finding a new way of looking at well-being. And I think the donut economics model, where we have, that green bit in the middle, the sort of meat of the donut, what is a safe space that we can live in? And a book I'm reading at the moment, I think it's Jason Hickel, called Less is More. I haven't got quite to the end yet where he says what the answer is, but GDP, being the sort of the be-all and end-all, was created not with that in mind. And I think we need to look at the kind of measures that you're referring to. And I think systemic change is a real issue, because I don't think we can change governments. I don't think we might be able to change some corporates. And yet I think at the end of the day, it might be about what we can do to help others change. And so the question that I now come to is, what do you think the drivers of change are? If we believe we're in an existential crisis, do people have to experience the problem for themselves, not hear about it from somebody else? So if you've got flooding into your house, what can you do to adapt, or which is one part of it? If you haven't got any money, that could be a driver that for you to look at charity shops more and say, well, how can I make some money out of the 20 suits that I've got in my wardrobe? What do you think are those drivers of individual change that I believe needs to happen so that more people get on a right to their MP like we do, to try and help governments change, right to the people who produce the goods that we buy, not consume. We're citizens, after all. End of question.
Yeah. Well, how long have you got? It's a comprehensive question. Change, well, we have to change everything. That's the truth of it. We literally have to change the way we live, the way we have our political systems, economics, social technology, everything. And the problem is that we've never actually achieved that in history. And when there have been major attempts at change, like the Russian Revolution or China, it's often led to something worse than was before. So it's very, very complicated to do this. I start from also, you mentioned around, will people change without experiencing climate change? The challenge we've got is we're the first generation to know the real threat, existential threat of climate breakdown, yet we're the last generation that can actually do something about it. And for most of the people who are causing the problems, which are us in this room and in the West, in modern countries, we will not see the impact, the real impact of climate destruction in the way people will in the Pacific Islands or in the Philippines or sub-Saharan Africa, where it already is very real. One of the biggest causes of mass migration and refugees is environmental destruction. You don't read about this, but people can't feed themselves. They can't grow crops because of desertification, changing. The whole of agriculture, particularly in a vulnerable country, is based on being able to predict the weather, it's having a stable weather, which we're now losing. So in order to change, my view is we can't do it on our own. I mean, although I'm talking about psychology, Jane asked a question about coming together in groups. We have to come together in groups. We've got to have these conversations. We've got to put pressure on politicians and work at every possible level and play to our strengths. So I do a lot of work with business, as that's my background. You might be better in another environment. We all play to our strengths. But it's also realizing that knowledge is not enough, and just talking about it in the way we talk about history, and we say how awful the Second World War was, how awful the Holocaust was. Well, we are going through something which could be more damaging to the planet than this at the moment, and we've got to stop looking at it as a spectacle or something happening over there, and understand that we're part of the problem and we can be part of the solution. But a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. So it's only by coming together and having these sorts of conversations and being honest And this is where I see as psychologists, it's our personal development is wrapped up in developing answers to this. We cannot separate ourselves and our psychological development from finding solutions. We have to be very authentic and honest with ourselves that we are part of a problem. And ultimately, politicians largely represent what we want. You know, people get elected not on, at the moment, not on climate breakdown, they get elected on jobs, on promises of prosperity, on, you know, tax, on short-term economic things, because people are so locked into the system. And it's only through having these sorts of conversations, I feel, that we can really develop. But join a party as well, put pressure on people, absolutely, all the time.
Yeah, interesting question. I'm trying to think about the way to break into it in any way that's different. I mean, one thought in my mind is you never know when you're halfway through a paradigm shift. I don't think people a few hundred years ago thought, isn't it great to be halfway through the Renaissance? It's something you kind of recognise when you look back on it. And I'm wondering if we can look back at today and think, well, we were actually coming through a paradigm shift. You know, there were shifts in the way people were thinking at the time. And I think, you know, signs of that might be we're shifting what we measure. That's one thing you said about the economy. If we shift in what we measure, then we shift in what we actually think and value. GDP was never invented for the purpose it's being used for now. We know that. But actually, even the accumulation of capital in terms of wealth is probably something that's quite dodgy long-term, but we don't even do that. So changing the way we measure things, changing the way we appreciate things probably does represent the fact that we go halfway going through a paradigm shift. When it comes to drivers of change, a phrase we've mentioned before, I think, in some of the advertising blurb, is that if you want to do small things, change what you do. If you want to do big things, change the way you think or the way you see things. And that's what I'm starting to see, is people are changing what they do. There are people with, you know, there's lots more solar panels on the roofs, there's lots more electric cars. There's a lot out there, a lot being done, having relatively little effect in terms of the direction of where we are. But I'm seeing people are actually changing the way they see things as well. So we're always told we're preaching to the converted. What I'm saying, though, is that what I'm noticing is that there are many more people who are in the converted tent than there used to be. A lot of people coming forward saying, it's always been my idea, I've always thought like this. But there's a lot more of them in the past. So I'm picking up that it's not just, you know, I was really one of a very small group of cranks 30 years ago. Now that group of cranks has got quite big now, which is quite good. So more and more people are saying, yeah, I've always thought this is quite right. And I think I am seeing that there are signs of a paradigm shift. Drivers of change, people's attitude, not just what people do, and also drivers of change, a real demand to change what we measure and what we appreciate. I think there's a lot more people now measuring and appreciating things which are not material. And it may be because everyone's just got too much stuff anyway. Having a bit more stuff, an iPhone version 93.1 or whatever we're up to, does it really make much difference? I think people are moving on from that.
Well, let me answer a little bit of that as well. I feel quite encouraged by the amount of noise in the city these days. When you're looking at, you know, the GDP and the ways that we measure our economy, a lot of people I know in the city are really getting concerned because they're starting to realise that we need to look at the SDGs, Strategic Development Goals, and we need to measure things differently because they're going to be measured on them, and consumers are going to start making their choices based on what they do. And I think it was quite encouraging that we were asked to talk to HSBC recently as Your Better Nature, because we often do speak to the converted and try to make them even more evangelical to go out and talk to others. But there's always going to be a limit to that. It's fantastic that the herd is bigger because people like being part of a bigger herd. But it is really important that the decision makers, the ones who unfortunately have the most influence on us, who are at the centre of the economics of a country and other countries, start to see that they don't have much choice anymore. They're going to have to make some change. And I think once they start changing, things could happen very quickly.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of the argument, let's say we can't change the system, you know, and there's a strong possibility that we can't if we look at history and precedent. Even within the rules of the game, institutions now, financial institutions, recognise that on its current trajectory, climate breakdown will cost the economy trillions. It will be the biggest disruptor to the economy and stability we've ever seen, worse than any war. So that's being really recognised. And similarly, the Pentagon, not the most green organisation in the world, have done a number of reports believing that what they call climate change will be the biggest cause of wars in the second half of this century. And that it's actually a military and strategic imperative, political imperative to prevent it. So the arguments are all over. I think what we're really lacking also is leadership. You know, don't we need a Roosevelt or a Churchill or somebody with the vision to actually go and take this and connect these dots?
Yeah, two questions. One is, as an environmental campaigner, I'm always struck by the ozone layer example as the only global environmental problem we've ever managed to really deal with properly. So I was interested to hear from you both why you think that's the case. And then the second one was really, again, like strategizing around, campaigning for change on the environment. Again, I'm always struck by how the psychology of decision makers is not really involved in that strategic process. We never really talk about, the underlying psychology of the people with really the power, whether it's the CEOs of fossil fuel companies or politicians. And I wondered if there's any research in that area or if you have any thoughts on that, because I think it's a big gap.
I'll start with ozone, yeah. And I don't want to overplay the ozone example, but it was a success. It was something that was identified. It had a clear cause and a clear answer, and it had something that could be done. It's interesting how it was found, and that's also a lesson, because it was found because the data that was already there was reanalyzed. It was found that actually a lot of the data that we already had was being sifted out because the whole didn't look realistic. So I don't know whether it's a computer or a human, they were getting rid of all the superfluous, obviously errant data, so therefore it's covering up the fact that there was a hole in the ozone layer. When data was looked at properly, there was a hole in the ozone layer. I wonder how many other things we're trying to cover up just by the way we measure them, but that's another point. But the point is, that was a solvable problem that could be solved. And I think, I'll turn it the other way around, I think a lot of people are apparent climate change deniers, not because they deny climate change, but because they think the answer is something they don't want to do. So in America, the right wing there thinks the answer to climate change is communism. Therefore, climate change can't exist. So this is another thing we need to overcome. Just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean there isn't a problem. And I don't think that's the case with the right wing in this country, for example. I think there are plenty of examples of people who don't see that as a left-right problem. But I think there is an issue there. We can't leave it until we see the answer before we recognise the problem. So I think that's the key thing there. And it was something that could be solved, and it was solved. But there are plenty of other examples that could be solved, and we haven't solved them. One thing that really gets me is peat. I've been having arguments about peat for 30 years. Exactly the same arguments, and everyone's saying, oh, we'll adapt to it, we'll change, we'll do different things. Hasn't happened for 30 years, and we're still having the same arguments. It should be banned.
No, good point. Just briefly on the ozone layer, for me, it was a very specific, concrete, singular action of changing, rather than most environmental change, which is complex, comprehensive, and cuts across many different disciplines, which is always much harder. So banning smoking is something that's very immediate, or stopping dealing with ozone layers the same. But we are looking at fundamentally changing what it means to be a human being and all the implications of that. And coming to your other question about change, I completely agree, and I see this in my work, in business change management or community change, is there is still an assumption that people are logical and are rational actors. And that's what economic models are built on, most decision-making models, most change models. We now know from people like Daniel Kahneman, who was the first psychologist to win the Nobel Prize, that we're fundamentally irrational. But we are all irrational. The phrase is, we make decisions based on emotion and justify on logic. If you actually understand how we make decisions, and most people aren't trained in this, and you need to factor it in, I completely agree. But that takes time, and it's complex, and a lot of change is, right, we've got a 3-month program, we have to deliver these outcomes, we need short wins, and that's not how it works. So it's it's a good point you raised.
bit more on that, Paul. Are you aware of any organisations or schools of thought that actually try to help people to influence the decision makers? You know, how do you reach them most successfully?
Probably not at the moment. No, I'm trying to think. No, it's a real problem. There's no question of it. Because the fact is, if I'm looking at business, for example, where I've had most experience in change, and both people who are trying to do sustainability programs, it's still a lot of greenwashing. It's largely, oh, we've got to have something to put in our corporate report. We've got to show something to the shareholders. Oh, we better get recycled paper. Oh, let's have some electric car points. But they're still selling products which are destroying nature, which have a ridiculous supply chain, a massive carbon footprint. People aren't challenging the central tenets of a business or the core rationale and methodologies and processes. It's tinkering around the edges. And until we address that and start measuring real change rather than superficial surface change, it'll be very difficult in my view.
And I suppose that once we can show examples of how leaders in big organisations have seismically changed their organisation by thinking differently with positive effect, that's where we'll start to get that school of thought in. So we have to be talking about finding them and then talking about those cases.
Hello, I'm Viviane Ducy, and I'm actually part of the Your Better Nature administration team. I'd like to explore a little bit more about the dominance culture and the exploitation, and when that kind of started really getting a hold. Was it post-war, or was it industrial revolution, or was it much, much further in our cultural history, maybe going from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists? So just give us a little bit more about that, please.
Great question. Well, Jane started in her introduction to me, and I'll just briefly tell you the story. So, about a book called The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. So in 1999, I was an IT entrepreneur, and I was going between conferences in the States. And I met a guy who was trying to sell my computer business, and he introduced me. He was also a literary agent, kind of weird, but and he introduced me to this man with a long ponytail in an airport lounge. And this guy gave me a book called The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. I wasn't even going to read it. And I got on the plane going to Florida and read it. By the time I finished the book on the plane, got to Florida, cancelled my conference, went up to see him in Vermont, and only went back to my computer office one day after that. I gave up completely working, because if ever, maybe it's happened to you, you've read a book or seen something that's literally changed your life. I'm called Paul, and it was a Road to Damascus experience for me. And the reason I love that book so much was it showed how, exactly what you said there, how this whole idea of human exceptionalism, domination of nature, control, disconnection from nature, how it had started, basically going back to the development of agriculture, when we stopped being hunter-gatherers, the development of language, the development of technology, and how this whole story of how, and through colonialism, domination, patriarchy, how we basically destroyed so much that was good in pre-Christian civilization. You know, the divine femininity and all these other areas. And it's a brilliant book. So I agree, it goes back to that. But the Industrial Revolution accelerated it, most definitely. And everything's intensified. But the root cause of our problem of disconnection from nature goes back thousands of years, for me, to the beginning of agriculture. Though we were destroying animals way before that. If you read Sapiens, a brilliant book some of you might have read about the history of humanity. We've been doing it a long time.
We've got time for just two really quick questions now, so I hadn't quite realised we were getting so into the conversation. The lady in purple next. There's a microphone coming to you. You don't need to move.
This is just making a point. It's not a question, but it's what you might say better nature. I do strongly believe that even if you just do one thing on your own, it's worth it. Because, about 30, 40 years ago, I became a life member of the Sussex Wildlife Trust and the RSPB. They had, at the time, they were focusing on palm forests, and it's shocking. palm oil. Oh dear. And so I focused very much on that in the last 30, 40 years. And I only buy products that have got where it says certified palm oil on the ingredients. And then about a week ago, I bought something on an impulse in Iceland, some little apple tarts, Mr. Kipling's tarts. And I turned it over and I looked at, oh my goodness me, it said palm oil and rapeseed oil. And I was really annoyed with myself for buying something that wasn't certified. And so I thought, I better ring them up. And then I thought, I can't be bothered. Then I thought, yes, I must. So I rang up. It said, if you've got anything, ring us up. And so I did. I rang them up. And I said, I'm not happy that you're using palm oil. That, we want certified palm oil, if you must use it, because the other one was rapeseed oil. And so she said, oh, well, yes. So she said, and I said, I want you, please, to pass this on, to your managers or whoever. And there's on the packaging of the box, there was a little sort of box saying, oh, no hydrogenated fat and all that sort of thing. I said, you can easily put in that box, no palm oil, please. So she said, oh, I'll pass that on. So that's the sort of thing you can do. And then I put it in my recycling box because I could have thought, oh, it's only me. They won't take any notice of me. Then I thought, yeah, do it.
Good girl. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. We love that sort of action. Everybody can make a difference, as you've just shown. So brilliant. Your call will make a difference. There's a lady at the front on the right here who would like to ask a question too.
I wish my question was before that one, because I don't want to sort of make it a bit more, depressing with what I was going to say. Like Tony, I've been an environmental activist for over 30 years, and I've been to hundreds of meetings like this where people talk on the stage, and then there's the questions and answers, and then we all go home, and some of us do ring up and do the thing or write to our MP, and I just kind of feel like I'm not clear, because I'm sorry I did arrive a bit late, whether what your better nature is hoping for, what you would count as a success at the end of this meeting. And for me, I see people going away. Maybe somebody's inspired to go and make sure they don't buy palm oil again, and we can all do our own actions. But for me, and I loved your two questions, but the more I was sitting there thinking about my own answers, the more I thought, I'm just a small bit player. I've done loads of things over the 30-odd years I've been an activist, even with Greta Thunberg and even with David Attenborough, the massive awareness raising we've seen and Extinction Rebellion in the last 3 to 5 years. It's great to see that, but the pace of change is glacial, and it's just not happening at the pace we need it to, which is what you were referring to, Paul. And I just also feel like it's also the people who come to meetings like this and are aware are just not in touch with your average person who's being hit by fuel price, rises, who don't have choices like some of us have to just think, oh, we can buy the thing that is less environmentally damaging, or not buy so many suits, because those people are just scraping a living or not, and especially after COVID. So I feel like there's something kind of missing, and I'd like to hear what you think would be success out of this meeting that actually brings system change rather than just a lot more personal change.
Great question to end on as well. So what does success look like going forward from here?
Right, let's have a think about that. Yeah, because I very similar views, because we've probably mirrored each other in our past, haven't we? And we've been to all these sorts of meetings before. It refers a little bit back to what I said earlier. I think we've been trying to encourage people to do things differently, which is fine. You can go and find lists of things to do anywhere. But I think actually what has been missing is the sort of thing we're talking about today, which is actually the mindset change underneath it all. So I think that's an important thing, which actually is difficult, because going out of the room and seeing a mindset change is going to be difficult. But I think that's the important thing. What else was I going to say? I've lost my train of thought. Yeah, what success? Well, sorry, the other thing I was going to say is that, the number of people we're talking to and the type of people we're talking to, I think has changed in the last 2 or 3 years. And that does give me encouragement. We gave a talk to HSBC the other day on this subject. I gave a talk to the MG Owners Club on climate change, for example. And it went down really well. And I thought I was going to be talking to some climate change deniers, these gas-guzzling monsters. I used to have one myself, so that helped. But no, not at all of it. And I think what I'm finding in different places now is that there is a category of people that are beginning to cotton on that were simply doing other things before. There's a lot of intelligent, sympathetic, understanding people out there who actually just haven't covered the environment before. They've been doing other things, which is fine. More and more, I'm meeting those sorts of people who are, realising the situation. And I think that is a movement. I think that is a change. People in different jobs altogether who are starting to say, well, that's another subject they're interested in. And the reason I find that encouraging is because actually they're the ones that are going to come up with some other novel solutions. One problem I think we had probably years ago is we thought we could tell people what to do to provide the answer. Doesn't work at all. One thing that may work is actually by presenting the challenge to people. If they're interested in it, they'll come up with their own solutions. And I think we're a bit in that category at the moment. Jane mentioned businesses. There are a lot of very sympathetic people in business who are now seeing their major risks are environmental. That's different to 5 or 10 years ago. So they're now starting to turn on to the idea of, so therefore what do we do in our arena? There is a worry that Paul mentioned earlier about nibbling around the edges. Bit of greenwashing rather than changing your basic business model. I think some people are seeing through that in business and thinking, well, is our basic business model right? Should we be doing something else? So, I'm probably like you. I mean, we have all these problems and we struggle to find the positive and to see how we're going to push forward. But I insist on bolting the rose-tinted spectacles to my eyes every day and seeing that there are some good things out there changing.
Well, for me, success, if I could wave a magic wand, I would love to see a movement, as I said earlier, like Alcoholics Anonymous, for people to come together and question why we're not happy. Why is depression so bad? Why is anxiety so high? Make all the connections we've been talking about, but do it in a way that isn't top-down, comes from, emerges from genuine group discussion. It's what we try to do climate cafes, climate conversations, but actually to make the connections between people's lifestyles and how they really feel and what they really want and the state of the planet. So it's not detached or it's not too scientific or too abstract. It's got to become more real and more intimate for everybody.
Well, thanks to you both. And we are going to have to draw it to a close there, but I would like to say thank you very much to the Brighton Natural Health Centre again, and also to Brighton Centre, some fantastic venue, and to Vass, who's been patiently filming all of this, as well as the whole Your Better Nature team. And most of all, thanks to you for coming on this foul day of ours, for making the effort, and we hope that you'll go out inspired to think differently and to have a different way of talking about your impact on the world with other people. So thank you very much again, and thanks once more to our speakers.